Hi, my name is Mike James, host of Hive Time, and this is part 2 of the Michael Bush interview. So let's jump right in.
According to the pseudo-drone theory of D. Lusby's, is that the problem with the Varroa mites is that they mistake our workers for drones because they're in 5-4 cells. Because in Serrana, they don't infest the workers; they only infest the drones. Varroa mites don't infest the workers.
So one of
go
the
ahead.
things that kind of piqued my interest is I've read 2 articles that kind of cited this. Well, they didn't cite, but they kind of determine somewhat of the same thing, that often the drone cells will be built towards the outer edge or the bottom of the hive, kind of where it's a little cooler, which I don't know the answer to, but it's something that I would like to potentially dig deeper into. Is is temperature and well, it's actually kind of 3 things: temperature, humidity, and CO2 concentration, how that's affecting the Varroa's determinability, if you will, of a suitable place to nest versus, just picking any random cell within the hive.
I never heard anybody bring that up before, but they certainly are more successful at a slightly lower temperature. The typical brood nest temperature, if it's higher, they're actually the Varroa are less successful, and if it's cooler, they're more successful. But I don't really know. I hadn't heard anybody think of it in terms of where in the colony they're nesting being related to that, just that they're more successful. But
Yeah, and I don't know either. It was just something I'd read, noted, saved the link for the research paper, and was like, this is something to look a little
it's an
further
interesting
into.
thing to think about.
Right. Well, and if you look, so with the hive that we were developing, one of the aspects that we were looking at potentially adding, and likely will in the future, is hypothermia treatment, which I found absolutely fascinating at the time. Is you can kind of hit this certain sweet spot of heat that quote unquote doesn't do much damage to the bees, but will almost entirely eliminate the Varroa within the hive itself. And granted, it's a treatment, but it was, and it's not a much higher than the temperature that's within the hive. I mean, it's only 4, 5, 6 degrees higher than the temperature that they prefer to keep raising brood.
It can't be much, because it does brain
Not.
damage to the bees if you get very much higher.
Right. And in the papers that have studied it, their main concern was the sperm within the queen. And so that was kind of, obviously, if it's damaging the sperm in the queen, that you've got major issues.
Yeah, but if you made all the bees mentally retarded, you also have major issues.
It's
So
very, very much true.
they're both probably just as devastating.
Right. Well, they had found that that it was their sucrose responsiveness that was impacted, but it was outweighed because the life expectancy of the bee went up, and so it was kind of a bit of a net wash.
Yeah, but the life expectancy of the bee goes up on small cell. There's research to prove that. So
Cool.
if the worker lives longer, they're going to be more productive and accomplish more, and they're not mentally retarded. So that seems like it would be an advantage, and I can get that advantage without using the heat. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Personally, let's look at this. Let's just be totally unselfish and look at this from the survival of the species of Apis mellifera. If you're breeding bees that require heat to stay alive, I don't think you're on the right track for the survival of the species.
I totally agree with you.
So
yep, I definitely agree with you on
I guess that's my bottom line as far as that. But let's go back to the small cell. So let's try the pseudo drone theory first of all, and that's that if the Varroa mites are infesting the drones and not the workers on small cell, because the workers are now small enough they recognize them as workers, and the drones are now enough different that they're targeting the drones, then the end result would be you'd actually get the drones, the Varroa mites would be more successful at reproducing because they're more successful in the drones. And if they're picking the drones instead of the workers, they'll actually be more successful. So your mite counts could actually be higher and you actually have less damage to your workers because they're damaging the drones and not the workers. So it's possible your mite counts could actually be telling you the opposite of what you really want to know is, do I have Varroa mites that prefer drones? That's my other problem with the drone removal method is you're removing all the drones, all the Varroa mites who prefer drones. Those are the ones I want. I want them to reproduce. I want the ones that prefer drones to reproduce. I don't want the ones that prefer workers to reproduce.
Right.
So I think that's, again, heading in the wrong genetic direction because I'm selecting for the opposite of what I want in Varroa mites.
And that's where I think that, you know, the conventional wisdom is that we're going after the immediate need for me and not looking at kind of how nature works in regards to natural selection. And it's the whole thing with treating. I mean, it goes back to the primary problem is you're creating, you're propping up the bee that needs help. And in this case, your example would be, well, now we're selectively breeding ones that prefer, that don't prefer the breed, the drones because we're killing them all off and they don't have an opportunity to breed again. You know, so the only ones running around the hive are the ones in the worker cells.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think as a whole, you could take away and just say, well, let's look at the solution that includes evolution, which is the long term, which could be the short term game. I mean, I've heard, might even been from you, that if we all stop treating within 3 years, it's likely the problem's gone.
Well, it's not likely. It's already been done. In Africa, they all got together as an industry and said, we're not going to treat. And they didn't. And in 3 years, it was over. Now, the bee scientists in this country, I've had dinner with many of them, and many of them have said the same thing. If we'd just never treated, in 3 years, this would have been over with. And now we're 25, I don't know, we're quite a ways down the line from when we started treating, and we're no closer to a solution.
So what do you, I mean, if you were king of the castle, I mean, what levers would you pull? Would you just simply tell people to stop?
Absolutely. Stop treating. Well, we watched it happen with tracheal mites. Tracheal mites were the end of the world, end of beekeeping as we knew it. It was all going to go down the toilet if we didn't treat. And so everybody treated. And then Varroa mites came along and they forgot all about tracheal mites because the Varroa mites were way worse. And so everybody stopped treating for Varroa mites. I've been speaking at beekeeping meetings for the last 20 years or so. And all this time, almost every time I speak, I ask everybody who's treating for tracheal mites to raise your hand. Okay. And in 2002 or so, half the room would raise their hand. In 2003, a lot less. The last several times I asked that, not one person in the entire room raised their hand. What happened? We quit treating. That's what happened.
What was how did they treat for tracheal mites? I mean, that's well before my time in beekeeping.
Well, menthol was the primary one, although they did other things. They used grease patties was one of the things they do. They take Crisco and powdered sugar and mix it together to make a patty and put it in. And apparently nobody seemed to know for sure why it worked, but apparently the research on it seemed to indicate that what it did was confuse the tracheal mites, because what the tracheal mite has to do is find a young bee, because an old bee, their chitin is too hard for them to chew their way through the spherical and get into the trachea. But a young bee still has a soft chitin when it first emerges, and it can chew through the chitin around the spherical where it breathes and get into the tracheal tube. So they thought that what it did was confuse them. They couldn't tell an old bee from a young bee because it would confuse their sense of smell somehow. But that's the best theory I heard, and there seemed to be a little bit of research to back it up, but it was never really considered proven, I don't think. And then some people would add other things to that basic thing of the Crisco and sugar. Sometimes they'd add essential oils and other stuff, but I don't know if it mattered or not. There were people just doing But that was the two main treatments, was menthol, and they just get the menthol crystals and they you put it in the hive and they would evaporate and it would. I think the menthol probably worked the same way. It probably
just
just confused them and they couldn't find the adults. I don't know that it actually killed the mites. Probably just confused them and they couldn't figure out the old bees from the young bees, and then they didn't succeed very well at reproducing. But
And then we just stopped treating for them, and bees decided how to accomplish
Well-
managing themselves.
well, yeah, probably just all the susceptible ones died. But
Well, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, through gene selection.
sometimes I think we use words that are not clear enough. When I talk
I
about
agree.
adapting bees to bees that are adapted to a northern climate, I don't mean that the bees figured out how to live with the northern climate. I mean all the ones that didn't die.
Right,
That's
right.
genetically the species adapted, but as far as the individuals, no, they didn't. They didn't adapt. They
perished.
just they just perished. But
Right. I forget, I had a follow-up to that, but it escapes my mind. Another thing I kind of wanted to touch on was something that you talk about with natural food versus feeding supplements. And one of the things that I found fascinating was the pH difference between honey and sugar. And I guess I never realized its effect within the hive itself because of that.
that's pretty dramatic, actually.
Yeah, I
Um,
found this, I had kind of the same reaction. I had no idea there was that large of a gap between the two of them.
Martha Gilliam did most of the research we have on the microorganisms that live in a healthy colony. She isolated 8,000 microorganisms that live in a bee colony and actually cultured them. And probably there are a lot more that you just can't culture because they live in some symbiotic relationship with some other bacteria or fungus or whatever that's in the colony, and you can't isolate them and grow them by themselves. But there's 8,000 that she isolated and grew by themselves. She actually figured them out. Well, some of them she figured out were pretty essential to the health of the colony. Among those were the ones that lived in the gut of the bee, and the ones that lived in the gut of the bee would the proportion of how many how much of what was living in the gut of the bee changed just based on nectar sources changing. And then if you feed them sugar syrup, it changes even more dramatically. And there's 2 or 3 studies out there on that. One of them is just on the longevity of workers. Workers live longer fed honey than they do fed sugar syrup. And that was their conclusion was that was based on the intestinal health of the bee.
Who did
Because
that
when they're
work?
eating sugar syrup, it's disrupting. I've got a link to it on my
Yeah, maybe we'll try to connect and
presentation.
grab some of those links, and we'll just throw them up for people to bounce off of.
Yeah, I've got a link to it in my presentation on the 4 simple steps to healthier bees, which you can get
Okay.
on my website if you just go to presentations and go to 4 simple steps. But there's a whole bunch of links in there to do with these kinds of things. So anyway, they live longer on sugars on honey than sugar syrup, and the reason is the intestinal health of the bee. That was the conclusion of that study. So what do you do about that? Well, I think the first thing you do is you try to manage them so you don't have to feed them. That's the best thing. But my problem is I find some years, like this last summer, I had a really productive honey flow and then a dearth, and then the populations dropped a lot, and then I had like all these boxes full of honey and just a little cluster of bees, and I'm just sure the small hive beetles are going to take it over if I don't do something. So I harvest a bunch of that honey just to try and keep the small hive beetles from taking over. Well, then the dearth continues and then it's fall, and now they're going to starve if I don't feed them. So I would love to have just left that honey for them, but
Right.
it was just the timing of it. If it was in the fall, I probably would have left that honey for them because there aren't so many small hive beetles in the fall. But so I ended up harvesting when I didn't really want to, and now I have to feed back sugar syrup. So when you find yourself in that position, what do you do? Well, I put ascorbic acid in it. There's several studies that ascorbic acid actually makes for healthier brood and healthier bees. So I boiled, I make 5 to 4, no, 5 to 3, I guess is what I make. Sounds right, 5 to 3 syrup. So I boil the water. And I'm making 5 gallons of syrup. So I boil the water, which is like 24 pints of water, I think. And I put a big, basically, if you were measuring it as level tablespoons, it would be about 2 level tablespoons of ascorbic acid powder.
Okay.
As it is, I just scoop a big scoop and it's piled up on top and I dump it in, but it comes to about that. And I dissolve that in the water and then I add the sugar. And that makes 5 gallons of syrup. So
And then you
I
feed
suppose
that to the bees?
yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know how much I changed the pH. I used to work at trying to get that worked out at my old location, but my new location, I just haven't had time to get around to measuring the pH. And besides, it gets really confusing trying to get a target pH. But if I was going to pick a target pH, it'd be 4.5.
Okay.
Because
And the
4.5,
honey, oh,
if you get
sorry.
too acidic, there's research that shows that if it's too acidic, it'll shorten the lives of the bees. And some of that honey is probably too acidic, but it's just the way it is. You know, they go gather it. But 4.5 is pretty much in the range of honey, but it's at the low end of acidity. So
And sugar was somewhere around 6. Is that not correct?
yeah, sugar's pretty much neutral,
Okay.
where honey's acidic. And I compiled the list. I don't think I ever put it on my website. I probably should. I compiled a list once of just all the acids that are in honey. There's a ton of them, in just minute amounts of, malic and formic and oxalic and acetic and on and on and on. But fumaric and I don't remember all of them. But so that's what makes the honey acidic. But that's just naturally occurring things in the nectar. But anyway, this ascorbic is actually known to be good for them, and that's why I picked it. The reason I know there's people who do other things, that there's people who put vinegar in it. The problem with vinegar is it has smell, and anything that has smell tends to set off robbing. I want syrup that has no smell. I don't want to attract them. I just want them to not starve.
Right. So when you mentioned that, that you had, a hive that had a smaller cluster, when you keep your honey on, I'm assuming that your supers are above your brood box, like most beekeepers. Is that correct?
Well, it starts out that way, but as soon as they shut down brood rearing, they tend to move
They
all the
start
way to the
pulling
top
it down.
box and spend the winter there.
But I mean, do you operate with queen excluders?
If I'm trying to raise honey, no. If I'm raising queens, quite often I do, yes, because it just simplifies my work.
Okay, and so the reason I'm asking that is if you've got supers on there, I've had it where I've left some honey supers on a hive, I just hadn't gotten to them, had the queen excluder on there, and they starved to death because they wouldn't leave the queen because of
Well,
that.
it was good. It was good of them not to leave the queen, because a lot of times they'll leave the queen behind and she dies under the excluder.
Right.
So
Yeah, no, they were all under the excluder. And
yeah,
that's
you
why
don't want an excluder on in the winter.
yeah, I know. I was just a bad beekeeper.
But in general, I tend to run hives with no excluder, but I've been using an excluder more and more as I've intensified my queen rearing, just because it simplifies my life. There's so many things where I need to go find some brood to shake bees off of, and then I know exactly
Yeah.
where it is.
Right.
And I also know exactly where the queen is, because I really like to find the queen before I start shaking bees out of the brood box, because it's awful easy to get a queen no matter how careful you're being.
Yeah.
And so knowing where she is extremely useful when I'm doing queen breeding. It's not so important when I'm raising honey. I don't care where the queen is, as long as she's laying, I'm happy.
Right.
Then there's always the argument of, well, what do you do if the queen lays in the super? Well, my boxes are all the same, so it's impossible for her to lay in a super, because if she lays in it, it's a brood box.
Right. Well, and how far up do you find that? First off, do you intentionally run 2 brood box? I mean, you're saying they're all the same, but to try to kind of reel it back in regards
I
to
run 8-frame mediums, nothing but 8-frame mediums.
Okay. And so is your queen typically laying in the first 3 bottom boxes?
She lays wherever she wants to, but usually she tends to be towards the bottom. Typically, I'd say she's laying in 3 boxes probably.
Okay.
And they may be the bottom 3, or they may be the next 3 up from the bottom. Kind of depends the time of year and just what they get in their head. Once in a while, they'll just chimney right up through the middle, and there'll be honey on the outsides and brood all the way up through the middle. Just, bees. What
Do
is
their
it?
thing.
Winnie the Pooh says you never can tell with bees.
Oh, Winnie the Pooh, how wise he was.
And he was always trying to get bees out of honey out of a hornet's nest.
I know, I know. Right. He always has his head stuck in one.
Never could understand that. I don't think he ever found much honey in there.
Maybe he was after the brood.
Maybe that was it, and they just didn't tell us.
Right.
They pretended it was honey. It was a euphemism.
It was his honey.
It was actually brood.
Oh, it's too funny.
But yeah, I run top entrances too, and people are always saying, well, won't they just put all the brood in the top box because that's near the entrance? Because there's all these truisms in beekeeping. Like they'll always put the brood nest next to the entrance. Well, horizontally, that's true. Vertically, it's not, because they always want to store honey over the brood nest. So the brood nest might start at the top if you just put them in a bunch of boxes with empty frames, foundationless frames. They'll start at the top, and the brood will be in the top box. That's true. And then they'll keep pushing the queen, and they'll do that even if you got a bottom entrance. They'll still start at the top because that's just their instinct. That's what they do in a tree. They go
Well, yeah,
up
they
the top
gotta
and they
build from
down.
the top. Yeah, exactly.
Now we create the illusion that they want to go the other way because we keep throwing empty boxes on top. But that's because we throw empty boxes on top. If we threw the empty boxes on the bottom, they go down.
Right. Which
But
is
that would be way more work for us.
exactly. Yep.
Because then I have to lift all the boxes off to put another box on. That's more work than I want to do.
Right. And
But
disturb them even more.
True. So we create the illusion that they want to go up. That's, they want to go where there's space, but they want to store honey over the brood nest. That's their instinct to get through the winter. So they're always putting honey over the brood nest. But so if you've got all 8 frame mediums and no excluder, and you started with 1 box and you keep adding boxes, well, they're going to keep storing honey over the brood nest. So they're going to be they may be in the bottom 3 boxes because she lays that much, but they're not going to be way up by the entrance.
Yeah.
That'd be rare. I wouldn't say it never happens, but I guess I found brood in the top box on rare occasions, but I can't say it was common.
Now, do you try to keep your hives? What's your thought on ventilating the hives?
I think the bees should be in charge of it. You should have 1 small entrance at the very top and no other entrances. That's what I think.
Well, I think the bees often kind of clue us in, and some of the new, I shouldn't say new, but some of the traditional hive has such large holes in them that the bees have a hard time kind of expressing their needs and closing those up. But some of our test hives that we had screen mesh over kind of like a duct system in the roof, and every single one of them, they sealed tight. They want no air flowing through there.
But you also have to understand the instincts of the propolis workers. Their instincts are to block the light. That's their instincts. They're driven by light. If you don't believe that, you can prove it easy enough. Especially if you're trying to gather propolis, just put a propolis trap on there and prop up the top, and so that there's light getting in, and they'll seal it up in no time flat. And you can create plenty of ventilation up there, but if the light's not getting in, they don't care. They're not driven by ventilation, they're driven by light. So
well, in this
I don't
case,
know that proves that it's better or worse. It's just their instincts.
Well, in this case, they had no access to light because it was a duct system. So what it was 1-inch piping made out of PEX that came out and then went out the side. And so there really was no way for them to see the light in there. And it was the only thing that seemed to make sense.
But they code if you want to gather propolis, I think the cheapest and easiest way to do it is buy metal screen, screen window screen and cut it to fit over the top and put it on there as a quilt, and they'll always propolize it up, even though there's no ventilation involved.
And go break it up.
They'll completely cut. I mean, they'll put it on so thick, it's amazing how thick they'll put it on that screen wire. And you can do that with a complete closed top, and there's no ventilation up there. They will cover that screen completely. But that's just their instinct to coat everything, and it's hard to coat the big gaps, so they're piling it on to try and get across the gaps in the screen.
Well,
So
it's hard to not draw the conclusion that they don't want air, because you look at a natural, tree hollow.
They don't want nearly as much air, for sure.
Right.
So here's my conclusion. First of all, let's talk about what is the need for ventilation, besides obviously that they need to breathe and they need oxygen. But the other purpose for ventilation is to get rid of moisture. That's their purpose all year round, is to get rid of moisture. If they're trying to cool the hive,
bringing it in too.
If they're trying to cool the hive, they're actually purposely bringing in water, evaporating it, and then they need to get rid of it so they can evaporate more of it.
Right.
And if they're making honey, they're evaporating nectar, and they need to get rid of the water so they can turn it into honey. And in the winter, for every molecule of sugar they burn, they make 2 molecules of water, and they need to get rid of that water. So that moisture is in there all the time. And where does moist air go? Moist air rises. So if you leave a little entrance at the top, the moist air can get out. But the problem is, if you put one at the bottom and the top, now you've created a chimney effect. And now I don't think the bees are in charge of ventilation anymore.
They're definitely
now
not.
They're fighting the ventilation that's naturally occurring, instead of being in charge of it. And I think they should be in charge of it. So
well, I think that there's kind of a selfish aspect to it for beekeepers in regards to it speeds up the honey production as well. And so from a honey producer, a commercial beekeeper, it's to their benefit that there's actually a bit of a chimney effect, not to the bees effect.
I don't know if there is or not, though. But they think there is, perhaps. I don't know.
Well,
because they still have to maintain the humidity and such in the brood nest. In fact, they need a certain amount of carbon dioxide just to have a healthy brood nest, and they need a certain amount of humidity to have a healthy brood nest, and they need the temperature to be very consistent.
Yeah.
So you creating more ventilation just makes them have to work that much harder to try and maintain all those factors.
Right. I'm not saying that it's positively affecting them. I'm just saying that I've heard lots of people talk about more ventilation, and typically it appears that decision is derived around honey production.
Well, I guess I think they can get plenty, though, as long as I put it at the top. If I put it at the top, the moist air can get out. And if I let the moist air out, the bees don't have to work to get the moist air out. It wants to go to the top. They just have to push it out the door.
Right. But then the bees themselves are doing more work in the brood chamber. I mean, all of our hives are insulated, and you'd be surprised. Well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised. But if you were to pull out a frame from the insulated hive, and then you pull out a frame of a equally strong hive in a non-insulated, even in the middle of summer, and you look at the 2 frames combined, there's half of the amount of bees on the insulated hive's frame than there are on the uninsulated hive's frame.
Well, see,
and
while you're on that topic, I can tell you how you can have half as many bees in there and still maintain the temperature. You make your frames 1.25 inches wide instead of 1 3/8 inches, and you'll have half as many bees keeping the same amount of brood warm.
Oh, what's that due to?
They don't have to fill the gap.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That's the spacing the bees would have built if you let them.
Yeah.
If you let them, they would have built them on 1.25 inch centers, or 32 millimeters if you're a Canadian, but 1.25 inch centers, and it takes half as many bees to fill this gap and keep the brood warm.
Yes.
And if you got small cell, they've got a third again as many cells in the same amount of space, so they can keep even more brood warm. So that's if I'm concerned about them being able to cover more brood with less bees, that's the first step. Now, I believe you that there's less bees, because on a hot day, if I go out there on a hot day and I'm trying to get bees to start mating nukes and whatever, the thickness of the bees on the combs in the afternoon on a hot day there's almost no bees on there. And on a cold morning, they're just thick. because in the cold morning, they're having to keep it warm. And in
Yep.
the afternoon, they're pretty much trying to cool it back off because it's in the 90s already. So, and the sun's beating on the hive. So,
Right. Yeah, we just find it fascinating just as we open them up because, anytime we're inspecting frames in the uninsulated one, they're always, we're managing the bees that are covering the cells and having to shake some of them off to do it. But in most cases in the insulated hives, we can just simply pull a frame out and look because it's not totally covered. And we contribute that to the fact that they're not on as much HVAC duty, if you will, within the hive.
see, my problem with insulated hives is that it always seems to create moisture problems. I mean, insulating the top doesn't because it cuts down on the condensation on the top, but I just always seem to have moisture problems anytime I bought like those foam ones. What was I don't remember the
Polystyrene.
names of them. The heavy styrofoam ones.
Yeah, they're
not
made
like
out of polystyrene.
yeah, they're about the density of balsa wood, but they're more dense than typical styrofoam, but they're about the density of balsa wood, and they were nice and warm, I think, but they get condensation in them
Right.
just really badly,
They do.
and the wood
Yeah.
doesn't seem to get the condensation that the styrofoam got. And then if I wrap them, then it just seals all the moisture in, and it seems to be even worse. I've thought about going to 2x and build my own boxes, but then they're so darn heavy. Man.
There's actually a research paper out there that studied, I think it was 3 different hives. One was just pure polystyrene on the inside. One was a insulated hive, and the other one was a traditional hive. And the findings were very telling. And what they found with the polystyrene was exactly as you said. If it's polystyrene on the inside, the bees have a hard time managing the moisture, and they almost every single group of bees that were in the polystyrene hive only were far more aggressive than in any of the other hives. So they were pissed off.
Huh.
It was,
Interesting.
yeah, I'll try to add that to our show notes for people to look
Well,
at
that was
as well.
kind of my conclusion. Is I think it's a great idea to insulate the hive, but nothing seemed to do that well. I thought about doing like a WBC style where you've got a box inside of a box, but I ended up not doing it mostly because I put all mine together, so my hives are all up against each other side to side and 2 rows back to back. So there's really only on a typical hive, except for the ones on the ends, there's only one face that's actually that's not up against another hive. So seems like I already have my 1.5 inch of wood between one cluster and another cluster, both of whom are heating those hives. So the double box just seemed like a lot of waste. But
yeah, well, and it's heavy. I mean, it's
well,
incredibly heavy.
see the WBC hive. You ever see a WBC
I
hive?
don't think so. Should look it
Well,
up right now.
it's a very popular hive in England. You've probably seen drawings of them and photographs of them just because they
Oh,
look
yes,
cool.
I do know what these are. Yep.
Yeah, so they have like a sloped outside to run the water off more, but
Right.
basically that's not really the essential part of it. I don't think it's that you have 2 boxes. You have a box inside and then an airspace and a box outside. So you don't have to lift the double box. You lift the outside box off and then lift the inside box off and then the outside box off and the inside box off. So you're not lifting 1.5 inch thick box. You're just doing 2 boxes. And the airspace seems like a good plan. In fact, I think you could probably put some styrofoam in that airspace, like glue it to the outside box, so it, still has a little bit of airspace, but also has the styrofoam on it. And then the styrofoam isn't on the inside causing condensation problems. You got wood, airspace, and then styrofoam.
Okay.
I've never done it. I've just thought about it.
But they are, I mean, like you say, they are very nice looking hives. Like they look like,
Oh, they're gorgeous.
yeah.
But they're complicated to build because they're all angled cuts and
Right.
yeah, that's a tricky proposition to build one. I saw somebody who, I think the plans used to be on BeeSource to do one like that for a Langstroth.
Okay.
So because you have to change all the dimensions because theirs is really made for a national, I think. British National, which is a square hive and all different dimensions. Anyway,
Yeah.
Julius Hoffman, who invented the self-spacing frame, is the guy who first talked about the fact that it's important to get the right space between the combs because they can keep more brood warm. Because at the time, everybody just did it by eye or by guess. Some people were spacing them purposely 1.5 inches, and some of them were spacing them 1.25 inches, and some of them were spacing them 1 inch. And he ended up deciding he thought 1 3/8 inches was the best. But if you just let normal sized bees build whatever they want to build, bees on natural comb building whatever they want to build, in other words, smaller bees, they're all 1.25 inch centers.
Like top bars, they'll just natural. And I have no experience with top bars, so excuse me if I'm like.
We usually put a comb guide in there and try to get them to build it on
like
in the
a
middle of
little
the
rail
frame
or whatever, right? There's like a
What's
rail
that?
there's like a little rail that sits in there on top, and they draw off of the top of that rail.
Well, it's a top bar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no sides and no bottom to the frame. There's no frame, just a top.
But so I guess maybe my
And the
question
top fills
is
all the gaps. Is that the point? The you cut the whole bar the width of you want the spacing to be, because there's no gaps between the bars.
right. And so will the bees draw out at that dimension, that 1 3/8 inches?
Oh, you can try whatever you want. I've tried everything from 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. When they're building brood, they want to build it 1.25 inches. When they're building honey, they want to build 1.5 inches. I think the 1 3/8 inches was a compromise.
Oh, okay.
And I think really what you want is you want the brood nest to be 1.25 inches, and you want the honey to be 1.5 inches. That's what the bees want, because they'll cheat. When I put all 1.5 inches in there, they'd cheat down to 1.25 inches, and then they'd end up in the middle of the bars. And when I did 1 3/8 inches, then they'd cheat and make the honey 1.5 inches, and they'd
Not
cheat over onto
cheating.
the other
They're
bar.
not cheating,
So,
Michael. They're trying to tell you something.
true. And I listened. So I made half and half. I made 1/2 inch and a quarters and 1/2 inch and a halves, and then I'd feed the 1.25 inches into the brood nest when I wanted to expand it, and I just have them sitting at the other end of the top bar hive until then. And then, yeah, I finally decided I was just going to go with them and not argue with them.
Yeah, that's probably wise. That's probably wise.
Because in the end, they're going to do what they're going to do.
They are going to do what they're going to do. And it's our job, I think, as beekeepers to take their lead and help them where they need to, and leave them alone when they don't need it.
Somebody said you let the bees lead the dance.
Yes, that's wise. Whoever said that is wise. Oh, very good. Well, I need to wrap this up. It was great having you. It was great talking to you about some of these things. And is there, if people want to reach out to you, is your website the best place?
Sure. Yeah.
And that is, I have it here in front of me. What is your URL?
Bushfarms.com. BUSHFARMS.
And you do some speaking engagements as well?
Yes.
And they can reach out to you in regards to that for like association talks. Do you travel for those?
I used to travel a lot for those. I am traveling a little for those now.
Okay.
Seems like during COVID, everybody was doing Zoom meetings instead.
Which is kind of nice, right?
I could probably do more of them that way, but I sell a lot more books when I'm there in person.
Oh, really?
Because I bring books with me, and people like them signed. And in fact, a lot of people bring their book that they already bought with them, and I sign them. So, and I like meeting people. The Zoom meetings, it's like you don't really get to talk to anybody. You just do your presentation, and
and then you're done.
And half the fun is meeting people and talking to people and sharing ideas, and hearing their responses to the things you've told them to do. For instance, this last weekend, a guy there was talking about the spacing on the combs. He says, "Yeah," he said, "I went to the 1.25 inch spacing," and he says, "Oh my gosh, those hives just explode in the spring." I said, "Yeah, because they can cover more brood." He said, I had no idea it was going to be that dramatic." Well, so you get that kind of feedback from people, as opposed to, well, I say this, but is anybody trying it?
Right.
I mean,
right.
So yeah, it's nice to talk to people and find out what worked for them and what they think didn't matter. And, because there's always things that it seems to you that it matters, and then somebody else tries it and they don't think it makes any difference.
Well, and there's so many variables as well, right? Like, I don't
Well,
know,
yes,
type of bee, type of hive, type of location.
yeah, climate
Right.
makes a world of difference. In fact,
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear he thought there was that big of a difference because he's in Florida. I thought in Florida it wouldn't make that much of a difference. I thought it made a big difference here because in the spring it's cold here in the spring. The bees are
Mhm.
struggling to raise brood. They're raising it, but they're struggling to keep it warm. And I thought it made a big difference here. I thought in Florida, yeah, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference. But he was like, no, no, it's a big difference.
Yeah,
I didn't
I would have
expect
thought
that.
the same thing. I mean, like you say, I mean, just even what we're dealing with here in Wisconsin, you probably are on the edge of it too. It was 60 degrees here. I don't know, 4 or 5 days in a row. And I woke up this morning, it's 14 degrees out the end of March.
Yeah, we've been having that. I think we're actually nice here today, but
Are
a
you?
few days ago it was cold. And a
You got
couple
any
of weeks ago it
dandelions
was really
popping?
cold. What's
Are
that?
the
Oh,
dandelions starting to pop?
no,
Not yet.
no, the grass is still brown. Nothing's coming up.
Yeah.
Well, actually, if I go out there, I can just see the dandelion, the rosette of the dandelion leaves starting to get green,
Okay.
but they haven't grown up at all. They're just still down in the grass.
Have you
And I see
noticed them
some,
pulling any pollen in, like from maple trees or anything yet?
no,
Not yet. Yeah, I'm still.
I would
way
think
too
that
early here,
it
too.
looks like the trees are budding. They might be blooming today. I might need to go out and look, and it just hasn't been that warm for them to fly much.
Right.
But I saw them flying a little bit yesterday. I went out and looked at them, and they were flying, but they weren't looking like they were busy. They just looked like they were just. It was warm enough to go outside for a minute.
No, and I've thrown my maple syrup bags on the trees, and there's only maybe like that much in the bottom of them, and they've been out there for probably a week now. So it's weather's just more or less fooling us like they do always here in the north.
Yeah, it's unpredictable. Always
Right.
has been.
Right. Oh, appreciate it,
Okay.
Michael. And I'll stay in touch. Maybe we'll get you back on here and occasionally to spread the word. And there's always more than enough to talk about.
Oh yeah,
So
Okay.
appreciate it.
you bet.
Thank you. Have a good day.
There was nothing left to say. How to get up, walk away. Know when to hold 'em, know when to fold.